2026 annual budget, unless it is restructured as we propose to address the socio-economic challenges our country is facing. Honorable Speaker and members, even if the allocations in the budget were to address the socio-economic challenges, financing the budget through reckless borrowing will cause the country even more pain. To finance this budget, the NRM government wants to borrow 32.075 trillion because taxes, non-tax revenue and grants will only generate 40 trillion. The NRM government will then splash the taxes collected and borrowed money on luxury and distribute a big portion of it to President Museveni's friends. Moreover, the Constitution and Public Finance Management Act were not followed in preparation of this budget. I want to start with the sources of funds for the budget. The government intends to raise 34.051 trillion from taxes. This represents 47% of the total budget requirements. The government will also raise 3.246 trillion from non-tax sources, representing 4.4% of the total requirement. The taxes and fees correction together will give us 51.5% of the total amount of money we require to finance the budget. Our budget will also be financed by grants worth 2.745 trillion, which is 3.7% of our financial requirement. The rest, as I said earlier, 32.07 trillion, which is 44.3%, will be borrowed from foreign and domestic financial institutions. This is the physical deficit we face as a country. Madam Speaker, I have provided a table. I don't see it on the screen. I hope it can be summarizing what I have said. Tax correction is projected at 47%. Domestic borrowing, 21 trillion, 29.5%. External borrowing, 10.6 trillion, which is 14.7%, and grants, 2.7 trillion, which is 3.7%. And then non-tax revenue of 3.2, which is 4.4%. Who will lend us the 34 trillion? Minister of Finance on page 19 of the medium-term debt management strategy is warning Parliament that because of past global recessions, concessional lending has drastically reduced. Creditors are now focused on resuscitating their own economies. The biggest borrowing, 68% therefore, will be from domestic commercial banks and several other funds. Only 32% of the borrowing will be from institutions such as World Bank, IMF, ADB, and other international funds. Only 9% of the loans to be procured for budget will be on concessional terms. Only 9%. 6% at semi-concessional and 16.7% at non-concessional and commercial terms. This government committed to restrict non-concessional commercial loans to financing infrastructure and self-financing projects through on-rent agreements that have the capacity of generating non-tax revenue to enable debt repayment. It is now contracting non-concessional loans to fund recurrent expenditure. Remember, last financial year, the loan of $789 million in 2023. Overborrowing from commercial banks is crowding out the private sector and is increasing interest payment almost beyond our reach. This financial year, we are paying 9.4 trillion in interest, not 9.4%. It's 9.4 trillion in interest to commercial banks, mainly, and 1.8 trillion interest to foreign lenders. In the next budget, interest payment will consume, which is now 11 trillion. Minister of Finance notes that borrowing from foreign sources poses a great risk on our reserves. To be safe, the Minister of Finance notes, maturing foreign debt should be kept at a certain percentage of our reserves. Right Honourable Speaker and honourable members, reflect on the debt burden you are creating before you say aye to the budget. That's why a report on public debt, grants, guarantees, and other financial liabilities is and was tabled together with the budget. Approving the budget means you have given the government a green light to borrow 32 trillion to finance next year's budget. You have in a way lost the right to complain when the Honourable Musasi begins to vent on traffic loan requests to Parliament. Minister of Finance itself on page 8 of the medium-term debt management strategy is complaining against expenditure requirements, against realistic revenue projections, which is raising the fiscal deficit and leading to more borrowing. The medium-term debt management strategy was also presented to this House. Interest charged on the money we are borrowing has significantly risen, and our currency continues to depreciate. This, Finance is reporting, has increased the borrowing costs and worsened Uganda's debt burden amidst reduced foreign exchange reserves. Madam Speaker, I want my tables to be screened because I need to make some explanations. I am on...
Do you have that report captured?
I actually submitted this report early in the morning.
Please capture it.
Will URA really correct the 34 trillion, the basis of which you are approving this budget? To finance the budget, Uganda Revenue Authority has now been given a 34 trillion target next financial year. This year, this current year, the target was 29.3 trillion. The taxes will be corrected as follows. If the tables were there, then I will be summarizing and I don't have to read everything. So these tables are too long. If I read them, we'll sleep here.
Let's have it uploaded.
So
can we have the report uploaded?
No, No, the information is here, Honorable Siagi, you know it. My work was to bring it here. So what do I do, Madam Speaker? Because these tables are important.
Let's have them uploaded.
Yeah.
Let's have the report uploaded. Can I have a look at your report? Let me see.
Madam Speaker, as you have guided, I will continue reading, but when eventually the tables are presented, you'll allow me to go back and explain, because the reason I put tables is not to read too much. I was on page 4 I'll come back to that when it is uploaded. I hope it is not deliberate. I want to go to page 6. It begins with a table. Madam Speaker and honorable members, I was explaining on page 3 coming to 6 the inability of URA to hit targets for the last 5 years. I now go to budget performance on page 6. The last 2 financial years should guide us when considering a budget with exaggerated figures. In 2020 to 2023, this Parliament approved a total budget of 52.548 trillion. The actual money raised through taxes and borrowing was 43.4 trillion. Minister of Finance issued or warranted 49.226 trillion. In 2023-2024, revised approved budget was 61.669 trillion. 50.172 trillion was warranted, but the actual money corrected and borrowed was 48 trillion. On average, we have been raising just about 50 trillion to fund our budgets. This election year could even be worse. We need to approve a realistic budget of not more than 55 trillion at worst. The reason the government presents an obscene figure is because they want to raise their amount 3% that they are authorized by the law to spend without prior parliamentary approval, which they will give to Pineti and Amina and others, and then come here for approval after. I now want to go to page 7, which is the allocation of the budget. Let Honorable Speaker and other members, we hope you have already noted that we continue borrowing to pay loans. Next financial year, total borrowing is projected to be 32 trillion, of which 10 trillion is to clear maturing treasury bills and bonds. It is actually now 11, which finance likes to sanitize and call debt rollover. So the NRM government goes to a money lender and asks him to lend it to pay an old debt. We must bring this nonsense to an end. Next financial year, you have budgeted 11 trillion to pay interest on money borrowed, and only 6.5 trillion for development. This is crazy, honorable ladies and gentlemen, that your budget, the biggest portion is to pay interest and not development. The table, which I am not able to display, is giving you the summary of the budget. 38% of the budget is debt servicing, 11% is wage, non-wage is 41.1%, and government is just 9.1%. I now move to servicing public debt, which I have told you it will take 38% of our budget. And that's why we need to pay a lot of attention to this. 38% of our budget is debt servicing. In a report on public debt and grants read in Parliament on March 27th, total public debt is given on page 12 as 106.22 trillion as at December 2024. This, in our calculation, is 52.4% of the GDP, which is given as 202.7 trillion on page 3 of the budget framework paper. The government committed not to borrow beyond 52.4% of our GDP in the Charter of Fiscal Responsibility. Approving this budget means you are allowing government to go against the Charter of Fiscal Responsibility, which will offend Section 12(6) of the Public Finance Management Act. The section states the annual budget shall, shall be consistent with the National Development Plan, the Charter for Fiscal Responsibility, and the Budget Framework Paper. On page 9 of the report on loans, Ministry of Finance observes there is a moderate risk of debt distress, mainly due to slow export growth and rising debt service burden, which amounted to 31.5% of revenue as of June 2024 and projected to stay above 20% throughout the medium term, mainly due to the cost of debt. Uganda has limited room to absorb economic shocks, meaning a significant economic downturn or a shock event could worsen its risk of debt distress. This is what the Minister of Finance says. To try to clear this huge debt, government has allocated 27.3 trillion, as I said, which is 38% of the total budget. And this is captured in vote 130. Interestingly, while 27.3 trillion is being allocated for debt servicing, we are seeking to borrow another 32 to fund the budget. One step ahead, two steps behind. We should at worst be borrowing less than what we are paying. You cannot repay 27 and then borrow 34. It means you are not paying. The table again, and that's why, Madam Speaker, it was important for these tables to be available.